If you want to understand when a housing market becomes truly dangerous, do not begin by asking when buyers get nervous. Begin by asking when sellers lose the ability to wait. That is the real line. A housing market can survive weak demand for a while. It can survive disappointed buyers. It can survive ugly headlines. It can survive bad affordability. It can even survive a long period where almost everybody agrees prices are too high. What it cannot survive forever is the moment when a growing number of owners need out more than they need their asking price. That is when the real damage begins. I have watched markets long enough to know that the first stage of a downturn is often misunderstood. People think the first stage is the crash. It usually is not. The first stage is the freeze. The second stage is the break. And the difference between the two is very important because in the freeze, prices can still pretend to be strong. In the break, pretending gets harder. That is the stage I believe much of the American housing market is moving into. Now, for the last several years, the country has been living through something many people did not know how to name properly. They saw fewer transactions. They saw higher mortgage rates. They saw first-time buyers getting crushed. They saw affordability become absurd. They saw listings sit longer. They saw seller expectations detach from buyer capacity. And yet, because prices did not collapse everywhere all at once, they told themselves the market must still be fundamentally sound. That was a shallow reading of the situation. What we were really watching was paralysis, not health. Paralysis buyers stopped buying because monthly payments became grotesque. Sellers stopped selling because they were chained emotionally and mathematically to old mortgage rates. So volume collapsed, but supply did not flood all at once. And because supply did not flood all at once, many people concluded that the market had somehow found a new stable equilibrium. I never believed that. A frozen market is not a healthy market. It is a market waiting for pressure to pick a side. That is what I think many people still do not understand. They look at price stability in a period of very low transaction volume and treat it like proof of strength. But if a market needs almost nobody to move in order to preserve the appearance of price stability, that is not strength. That is a standoff. And standoffs eventually end when reality forces somebody to act. The important question has always been which side would move first. Would buyers come back or would sellers be forced out? A great many people kept betting that buyers would come back if rates merely eased enough. That was the comforting theory. Cut rates a bit, let mortgage rates drift lower, watch demand recover, let normality return. That theory looks much weaker to me now because the rate cuts came and the buyers did not return in the way the optimists promised. That matters. It matters a great deal. When a medicine is applied several times and the patient still does not get up, the honest observer stops asking whether the dosage was emotionally satisfying and starts asking whether the diagnosis was wrong. I think the diagnosis was wrong. The problem was never just rates. The problem was price relative to income, price relative to payment burden, and price relative to what ordinary families could carry without financial self-harm. If the typical household cannot afford the typical home without stretching into dangerous territory, then the market is not illiquid by accident. It is illiquid by arithmetic. And arithmetic is a ruthless thing. It does not care how long a seller wants to believe last year. S-comp remains relevant. It does not care how many bullish slogans the industry repeats. It does not care how emotionally attached people are to the prices they saw in 2021 and 2022. If the monthly payment has divorced itself from median household reality, then demand becomes selective, then thin, then frightened, then absent. That is where we are. And when demand remains this weak for this long, something eventually changes on the seller side. That is where phase 2 begins. I do not mean phase 2 as a dramatic marketing phrase. I mean it as a structural shift. Phase 1 was the frozen market. Phase 1 was the standoff, low demand, low transaction volume, high asking prices, low willingness to cut, strong lock, in effect from old mortgages, people sitting still, hoping time itself would rescue them. That phase can last a while. It did last a while. But phase 2 is different. Phase 2 begins when waiting stops being an option for a growing share of owners. The market does not need all sellers to become desperate at once. It only needs enough pressure, enough places to turn isolated discounts into local comps. Local comps into broader repricing into negative equity, and negative equity into more forced behavior. That is how housing downturns actually spread, not in one theatrical explosion everywhere on the same morning, through pressure, then liquidity loss, then forced decisions, then new comparable sales, then lower confidence, then more pressure. It is a chain reaction. And chain reactions usually begin in the weakest pockets before the public accepts that the pattern matters. I think that is what we are seeing now. The most obvious weakness has emerged in the Sunday Belt and in the speculative outer markets that enjoyed explosive enthusiasm during the frenzy years. That is not surprising. Those markets got the most migration, they got the most narrative energy, they got the most new supply, they got the most investors convinced that inbound demand would remain permanent. And now they are showing the most visible strain. This is what always happens in a broad cycle shift. The markets that benefited most from the final phase of excitement often become the first to show the real costs of overextension. What I find especially revealing is not merely that prices have weakened in some of those areas. What I find revealing is the combination. Demand weakness, longer days on market, rising price cuts, growing shares of listings failing to find buyers, a rising number of owners underwater, a larger pool with very thin equity cushions, and distress concentrated among the buyers who arrived latest and put the least amount down. That is not random noise. That is the anatomy of a market that is moving from inconvenience into structural fragility. A great many people make the mistake of looking only at the current negative equity percentage and reassuring themselves that it is nowhere near the catastrophe levels of the last great housing crash. That is a lazy comparison. Of course, it is nowhere near the final stage of the previous crash. The question is not whether the disease has already reached its terminal form. The question is whether the early pattern is recognizable, and I think it is. The beginning never looks like the end. If it did, nobody would need judgment. The early innings always look smaller, more local, more explainable, more containable. That is why they are dangerous. The public keeps saying it is only Florida, it is only Austin, it is only investors, it is only condos, it is only certain vintages, it is only FHA borrowers, and so on. Markets love the language of only right before only becomes everywhere enough to matter. You must learn to distrust that word. It is usually the last refuge of people who want to delay recognition. Now, I want to explain why the underwater borrower story matters so much. A homeowner with strong equity can suffer a paper decline and still behave rationally. He can wait, he can rent the house if needed, he can sell without writing a large check, he can endure. A homeowner with no real cushion is in a very different position. If prices fall modestly and he is already close to the edge, the house stops feeling like a stable asset and starts feeling like a trap. If a job changes, if a divorce happens, if relocation becomes necessary, if insurance rises, if repairs appear, if association fees jump, or if taxes move against him, he no longer has the luxury of calling himself a long-term owner. He becomes a candidate for distress. That is the difference. Housing markets can absorb disappointment better than they can absorb forced sellers. The crowd always looks at prices. I prefer to look at conditions that create forced sellers. That is where tomorrow, as price pressure comes from, and there are several pipelines feeding that pressure. Now, one is the new vintage buyer who purchased near the highs with very little money down. That buyer is especially vulnerable because he entered with the least room for error. A second is the owner in a market where supply grew too fast relative to current demand. A third is the condo owner facing rising assessments, insurance pressure, financing friction, or structural requirements that turn a manageable monthly burden into something intolerable. A fourth is the investor who discovers that carrying costs and exit liquidity no longer support the story he used to tell himself. And then there is a fifth channel, one that I think many people still do not appreciate enough: commercial real estate and the financing wall behind it. People like to separate residential from commercial as if the two live in different universes. They do not. The banking system ties them together. Regional and smaller institutions matter here because they do not only finance homes, they sit close to local property ecosystems, local developers, local credit, local refinancings, local land values, and the broader confidence structure in the communities where housing is transacted. If enormous amounts of commercial real estate debt have to be refinanced in a much harsher rate environment, and if some of that debt cannot be refinanced cleanly, then forced sales and balance sheet stress do not stay politely inside one box labeled commercial. They leak, they tighten credit, they reduce flexibility, they alter lender behavior, they change what kinds of buyers can qualify, what kinds of projects get financed, what kinds of risks are tolerated, and how aggressively institutions want to extend themselves. Housing does not live outside that ecosystem. It breathes the same credit air. That is why I dislike narrow narratives. A housing downturn is almost never only about housing. It is about affordability credit, migration, psychology, leverage, and the willingness of institutions to carry stress without pulling back. When several of those begin leaning the wrong way at once, the market does not need a single dramatic spark. It simply needs enough pressure to convert the frozen sellers of Phase 1 into the active sellers of Phase 2. There is another force now that I think deserves more attention than it is getting: migration. For years, migration into certain Sunday Belt states became one of the strongest stories in American housing. People moved for taxes, they moved for weather, they moved for remote work flexibility, they moved for relative affordability, they moved because everybody else was moving. That last reason matters more than people admit. Once a migration story becomes socially self-reinforcing, it starts to support all sorts of bad decision, making builders build more aggressively. Local owners become more demanding, investors underwrite more optimistically, Politicians behave as though demand is their birthright. The whole place begins pricing itself like its runway has no end. Then the engine slows, and if the engine slows hard enough, the market discovers that it built supply and expectations for a wave of people that no longer exist in the same form. That is not a small adjustment. That is a fundamental repricing of narrative. And when narrative is repriced, housing can get hit very hard because so much of late cycle pricing depends not on current local incomes, but on belief in continuing inflows. If the inflow fades, the story must find a new support. Often that support is much weaker than people hoped. That is why I take the migration slowdown so seriously. Not because movement stops entirely, because a market priced for abundance becomes vulnerable when abundance turns into moderation. Now let me speak about the markets people think are safe. This is where the story gets more subtle. Some areas in the Northeast and Midwest have looked impressive on the surface. Tighter inventory, more resilient prices, less obvious speculative excess, less overbuilding in the recent cycle. So the public begins making another classic mistake. It assumes resilience and invulnerability are synonyms. They are not. A market can be more supply constrained and still become risky if price keeps rising while deeper demographic or affordability realities move the other way. This matters because many people are now looking at certain northern and midwestern markets and telling themselves those places are immune. Immune from what? From gravity, from population shifts, from affordability pressure, from the eventual convergence that often occurs when one region has already corrected and another has only been protected by lack of supply. I do not think that is a wise assumption. If a market is rising while losing population or relying on very tight inventory to conceal how expensive it has become relative to its long-term appeal, then caution is still warranted. I am not saying those markets collapse tomorrow. That is not my point. My point is that safety should not be defined only by whether the supply shortage is still helping you right now. The question is what happens when the supply shortage eases, or when affordability fatigue deepens, or when outmigration eventually does what outmigration does to the base of long-term demand. A market can look healthy until the day its support structure changes. That is why I dislike static labels like safe market. Markets are not safe. Structures are safer or weaker. Conditions are more or less fragile, and conditions change. What I would tell any buyer right now is this: do not confuse relative resilience with absolute safety. A place can be holding up better and still be too expensive for the risk you are taking. A place can have lower supply and still be leaning on unsustainable assumptions. A place can be less sick than Florida condos and still not be a bargain. The housing industry has always been very good at turning comparative comfort into absolute reassurance. I have no use for that. If I were buying, I would want numbers, not mood payment, burden relative to my actual income inventory direction, local employment base, migration pattern, insurance burden, tax structure, pending sales trend, price cut behavior, days on market composition of demand. Not just asking what happened 3 years ago when everybody felt rich. I want the current arithmetic now. Let me return to the central issue. What exactly makes Phase 2 different? Phase 1 was a market in suspension. Phase 2 is a market where suspension starts failing. In Phase 1, the lock in effect dominated. Owners with very low mortgage rates felt no rational urgency to give them up. So even though demand was weak, supply stayed artificially constrained that held the line. In Phase 2, the composition of ownership changes. A larger share of recent buyers do not have golden rate mortgages. A larger share of pressure builds in newer vintages, investor cohorts, and people whose holding power is much weaker than the headlines suggest. At the same time, negative equity expands from an isolated issue into a feedback loop. At the same time, delinquencies rise in the weaker borrower classes. At the same time, foreclosures and distress resolutions pick up. At the same time, migration slows and supply sits. At the same time, months of inventory become more normal again, which suddenly makes seller refusal less powerful than it was in the freeze. That is Phase 2. It is not merely lower demand. It is the moment lower demand meets growing seller necessity. That is why I think it is more dangerous than the last several years. Even though the public became numb to housing weakness because it had gone on for so long without a nationwide visible collapse, numbness is not safety. Numbness is often just delayed recognition. There is a line I have repeated in many different contexts. You do not get paid in markets for what is obvious. You get paid for what is true before it becomes socially comfortable to say. What seems true to me now is that the American housing market is moving from a buyer strike into a seller pressure cycle in its weakest regions, and that this shift matters because forced supply is a very different animal from theoretical inventory. A theoretical seller can hold the line. A forced seller cannot. Once enough forced sellers appear, the market stops clearing on hope and starts clearing on need. Need is a brutal appraiser. It does not care what you paid. It does not care what your neighbor got in 2022. It does not care how much granite is in the kitchen or how emotionally attached you are to last cycle. S peak. Need clears at the number that gets the property moved. That is when comps reset. That is when the previous owners begin watching their own equity shrink. That is when the owners with thin cushions begin calculating whether they should get out before the damage deepens. That is how a housing market rolls downhill. Not every place, not all at once. Enough places, enough time, enough pressure. That is sufficient. What would I do if I were a seller in a weak market today? I would become honest faster than the competition. That may be the most valuable sentence I can offer. If you genuinely need to sell in a market where inventory is rising, demand is weak, and price cuts are becoming common, then your enemy is not the low offer. Your enemy is time. Every month you wait in a weak market can cost more than the discount you were too proud to accept earlier. That is a hard truth, but a necessary one. A lot of sellers are not really selling homes. They are defending memories of prices. That is a terrible way to transact in a falling or softening market. If you need liquidity, price for liquidity. If you need certainty, price for certainty. Do not let ego turn a manageable concession into a larger future loss. And if I were a buyer, I would do the opposite of what the crowd usually does. I would be patient without being passive. I would study local data rather than national mood. I would ask whether I was buying into a genuine local foundation or into a market whose apparent resilience was simply late cycle tightness masking future vulnerability. I would care deeply about all-in monthly cost, not just the sticker price taxes, insurance association fees, maintenance, future assessment risk. I would ask whether the market's population and economic direction actually support the price I am paying, or whether I am merely financing someone else's belief that their pandemic-era comp still rules the world. If the numbers do not work now, I would not invent a story to rescue them. That is how people get trapped. The market has a way of humiliating people who use hope as a mortgage instrument. Now, I am not saying the country is about to relive the exact script of 2008. History never repeats with that kind of generosity. The plumbing is different. The borrower mix is different in some respects. The regulatory environment is different. But when people say this is not 2008, they often mean something far too simplistic. They mean it cannot be dangerous because the costume changed. I do not care about the costume. I care about pressure. And the pressure now is very real. Demand has stayed weak for too long. Affordability is broken. Lower rates have not revived the market the way many expected. A meaningful underwater population has emerged and is rising. Millions more are thinly cushioned. Foreclosure and delinquency stress is showing up first in the most vulnerable borrower groups. Commercial refinancing stress is looming. Migration has slowed in the very places that priced housing as if migration were eternal. That is enough pressure to deserve serious respect. In markets, serious respect is usually much more profitable than false reassurance. I would rather sound cautious a year early than sound calm a month late. That has served me better than trying to be socially impressive. One of the oldest errors in economic life is to confuse temporary stability with permanent resolution. Frozen things can look stable. That does not mean they are healthy. The real test begins when motion returns, and motion is returning now, not because demand has come roaring back, but because seller pressure is beginning to do what demand would not. That is a much darker form of motion. It does not create strength. It reveals weakness. The public always wants one clean sentence. So here is mine. The first phase of the housing downturn was about people refusing to move. The second phase is about a growing number of people no longer being able to refuse. That difference is everything. Once you understand that, you stop reading the market like a spectator and start reading it like an allocator of risk. You stop asking only whether rates are lower. You ask whether the system is more liquid, more affordable, more durable, more supported by real demand, and less dependent on owners who can no longer wait. That is the adult way to see it. And if I had to leave you with one final thought, it would be this. Do not respect the headline more than the balance sheet. Do not respect the asking price more than the monthly payment. Do not respect the old comp more than the current demand. And do not respect the story of safety more than the structure of pressure beneath it. Housing cycles are slow enough to lull people and violent enough to punish them once they are lulled. That is why calm, clear arithmetic matters so much right now. Not because fear is useful, because clarity is what keeps you from becoming one more participant who realizes too late that the freeze was never the recovery. It was only the pause before forced reality began to move again.